Today on Beyond History, Knoxville's Black experience.
So truly it was not an all-American city when all the Americans, African Americans, and others could not enjoy the privilege of being an American.
The civil rights movement as it happened in the city.
We began to demonstrate at the theaters downtown, principally the Tennessee and the Bijou. Probably hundreds of people were put in jail as a result of the demonstration.
As history records, it becomes one of the bloodiest, most violent parts of our history with respect to race relations.
The 1919 race riots, what led up to the Red Summer.
It was one of the most fascinating speeches I'd ever heard.
Plus the story behind Martin Luther King Jr.'s visit to Knoxville in 1960.
The winner and new champion, Frankie, the Surgeon Randall.
And a world champ from East Tennessee, we celebrate Frankie Randall's greatest achievement. We begin today with a look back at East Tennessee's past, starting with August 8th of 1863, when a group of enslaved African Americans in Greenville were freed from their enslaver, Andrew Johnson. He later became the 17th president of the United States. Today, the 8th of August, is known as Emancipation Day. People in Knoxville use the day to reflect and celebrate that moment in Tennessee history. It's been more than 16 decades since Harriet Tubman led enslaved people to freedom along the Underground Railroad. One of those stops was right here in East Tennessee. In 1862, East Tennessee Quaker Wilson J. Hackney from Friendsville used a cave on his property to help people escaping slavery or the Confederacy. He outfitted what's now known as Cudjoe's Cave with enough supplies, food, and bedding for 50 people at a time. Hackney's cave helped more than 2,000 people on their way up north. In 1919 was a year of high racial tension in Knoxville. It led to what we now know as the Red Summer. Riots spread to the city's Black community, and it all started when a man was arrested for a crime some say he didn't commit. Here's 10 News anchor Abby Ham.
The story goes that supposedly this African-American male has killed this white female.
Maurice Franklin Mays was a well-known figure in Knoxville in the early 1900s. A politician and former deputy sheriff, Mays also dabbled in gambling and bootlegging, which raised the ire of local police officer Andy White. In August of 1919, an intruder entered Bertie Lindsay's home and murdered her in her bed.
Her cousin, who was staying with her at the time, said a black man did it. But this policeman who hated Mays and who had threatened to put him in the penitentiary said, I know exactly who did it. Went by Mays' house and arrested him.
The officer brought Mays to the scene of the murder, where he was quickly identified by Lindsay's cousin, Ora Smith, as the man who committed the crime.
It doesn't take long for word to hit the streets.
The next morning, a mob of angry whites began congregating outside of the jail where Mays was being held. A few were able to break in and began searching for Mays, but were unsuccessful.
The sheriff knew they were coming and put a wig and a dress on Mays and snuck him down to Chattanooga for safekeeping.
The mob's hunt for Mays didn't end at the jail.
So they broke into hardware stores and places that sold guns and knives and went to the heart of the Black community.
Many businesses in Knoxville's Black neighborhood were destroyed, and the National Guard had to be brought in. By the end of the riots, there were hundreds injured and 7 dead, 6 blacks, 1 white.
As history records, it becomes one of the bloodiest, most violent parts of our history with respect to race relations.
Mays was sentenced to death by an all-white jury and died in the electric chair on March 5th, 1922.
Did he kill and murder a white woman in the summer of 1919? There's no evidence to suggest he did. There's just one person.
And you can read more about the Red Summer of 1919 right now on the WBIR app. Coming up, both Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Muhammad Ali made stops in Knoxville, how they impacted one of the leaders of the local civil rights movement. But first, the tamale has been a culinary staple in Knoxville since the late 19th century. We'll show you the surprising origins of this hometown favorite. East Tennessee has a rich and deep culture, especially when it comes to food.
One dish that was introduced by an African-American male in the late 19th century was the tamale. It took Knoxville by storm.
Yeah, the idea of corn-based dough wrapped around various meats, cheeses, and vegetables dates back thousands of years. A man named Harry Royston brought it to Knoxville in 1887. Royston picked up the tamale as part of a traveling carnival. He pushed his food cart around the streets of Knoxville, providing a unique food experience.
This happened 80 years before Knoxville had a Mexican restaurant. We were eating Mexican food in the form of tamales. It's also important to remember the African American heritage and the evolution of tamales and the popularity of tamales here.
In the 140 years since the tamale's introduction, many tamale shops have opened in the area. They include Mary's on Magnolia, Green's in Mechanicsville, and Royston's own shop around the block from where Good Golly Tamale now stands. Whether it's Good Golly Tamale or someone selling them out of the trunk at a church sale, the tamale tradition is alive and well here in Knoxville.
And it looked so good in that video.
Oh,
my
amazing.
Gosh. All right. Well, Big John Tate isn't the only world boxing champion from East Tennessee. Up next, how a man from Morristown beat the odds to capture his first of 3 world championships. The height of the civil rights movement happened in the 1960s around the country and right here in East Tennessee. 10 News anchor Emeritus Bill Williams shows us the story of the civil rights movement as it happened in Knoxville.
Although public schools in Knoxville were being integrated as a result of legal action as early as 1960, African Americans still were denied access to theaters, restaurants, and other businesses in downtown Knoxville. And there's where the protests were concentrated. One of the leaders of the demonstrations was Avon Rollins, who would later march through the South with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
We're students at the University of Tennessee. I was along with Mary and Barry, and we joined with forces with students from Knoxville College. And we began to demonstrate at the theaters downtown, principally the Tennessee and the Bijou. Probably hundreds of people were put in jail as a result of the demonstration. And what you see is probably on the film is a particular African-American policeman named Jimmy Rowan, who was carrying some of the students to prevent particular young ladies from being dragged or pushed or shoved or abused and carried off to jail.
Ironically, one of the movies showing during some of the protests was To Kill a Mockingbird, which had a theme of misunderstanding and prejudice toward blacks in the South. Another irony was the naming in 1963 of Knoxville as an All-American City by Look magazine. That also prompted protests by black college students.
Because it truly was not an all-American city when all the Americans, African Americans, and others could not enjoy the privileges of being an American.
Protests were also aimed at cafeterias and restaurants in the University of Tennessee neighborhood. African American students were often joined by their white friends. It is said that sign preparation and planning meetings for the marches were held in the Presbyterian Center at UT. That reportedly resulted in the dismissal of the minister who ran the center. On July 5, 1963, as a result of behind-the-scenes urging by Mayor John Duncan and realization by local merchants that African-American customers would bolster business, theaters, restaurants, and other venues were open to blacks. The Knoxville Civil Rights Movement was, for the most part, orderly and failed to produce the violence experienced in other parts of the South. And yet it was a time of tension and dramatic change for the city and all of East Tennessee.
One of the leaders of the Knoxville Civil Rights Movement was Robert Booker. He helped formulate the plans and led the movement, seeking the right for African Americans to be served at lunch counters downtown. Booker was also present for the visits of 2 leaders of the National Civil Rights Movement, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Muhammad Ali. Here are his stories of those events.
It was one of the most fascinating speeches I'd ever heard. Dr. King told the class, you're now graduating and you're getting ready for the world of work. And remember, when you go to work, do the very best you can. If you become a teacher, teach like Shakespeare wrote plays. If you become a doctor, practice like Beethoven wrote symphonies. And even if you are a street sweeper, sweep streets like Raphael painted pictures. He taught us, turn the other cheek and you will get the sympathy of the masses of the people, and that's what we did. It certainly worked here in Knoxville for us. On behalf of the mayor and the people of Knox, I salute the greatest of all those who box. He said, "Who wrote that?" I said, "I did." He said, "Can't nobody write poetry like that?" I mean, he said something else which I can't say on TV, but he was a card all night long. He kept us in stitches. He was a true hero. He, like Martin Luther King, put himself on the line. And so we in Knoxville affix our official stamp in welcoming this man who is truly the champ.
Well, from one boxer who visited East Tennessee to another who made it his home, Karthik Venkatraman shows us the story of Frankie the Surgeon Randall.
Hopefully you've heard of Knoxville's heavyweight boxing champion Big John Tate, but did you know another three-time world champ grew up just down the road in Morristown?
And hailing from Morristown, Tennessee, Frankie the Surgeon Randall.
Frankie Randall was a standout amateur boxer who turned pro in 1983. Over the next 11 years, he tallied up an impressive record of 48 wins, 2 losses, and 1 draw. In 1994, the Hamlin County native earned the opportunity to fight for the WBC light welterweight championship of the world against undefeated Julio Cesar Chavez, who boasted a record of 89 wins, 0 losses, and a draw. And in the 11th round,
For the first time in his career! Unbelievable!
On that night in the MGM Grand Arena, Frankie Randall became the first to defeat the legendary Chavez and won his first world championship in the process.
The winner and new champion, Frankie the Surgeon Randall.
Randall would go on to win the WBA light welterweight championship on 2 occasions and would retire in 2005 after over 2 decades in the ring. Unfortunately, Randall passed away in December of 2020 and is buried in Hamlin County, but his life and contributions to the sport of boxing won't soon be forgotten.
Well, music is ingrained in the culture of East Tennessee. For African Americans in our area, it all began with a single instrument. The origins of Black Appalachian music is next. Tennessee is a state rich in music heritage.
For African Americans, their musical origins date back to the late 18th century and one-stringed instrument. Digital storyteller William Winnett has more.
Light rain, baby falling down. The music that comes out of the black musicians and the Southern Appalachian musicians is American music. It was created here in this country, not something that we brought in from some other place.
The African American influence on Appalachian music dates back as far as the 1790s.
Some of the very first documented evidence of black music in Appalachia happens to be the presence of banjos on riverboats that came up the Tennessee River into the Knoxville area.
The sounds of the banjo led to the introduction of what we know today as the blues ballad.
They were story songs introduced by African American musicians, often based on telling stories about prominent African American figures in the community, sometimes kind of mythologized and sometimes quite accurate and merely documentary of the real deeds of real people.
The most famous of these mountain melodies was the song John Henry.
Well, John Henry was a little baby sitting on his mammy's knee. Well, he picked up a hammer and a little piece of steel. He said, "A hammer gonna be the death of me, Lord, Lord."
I think what really is important is that the ballad was so powerful, it transfixed across the entire population, and people of all walks of life sang John Henry and continue to sing John Henry today.
By the turn of the 19th century, the banjo had been adopted by whites and used in minstrel shows, which were quickly becoming the premier form of entertainment across the country. And although the instrument became appropriated, the black influence continued to be present in the performances.
Most of those performers were of white background, often learned, in fact, from slaves that were on the plantations of the early 19th century South.
Black Appalachian music carried on, but given the lack of documentation at the time, a lot of the early African American musicians have unfortunately been lost to time.
It's one of the tragedies of history is that, a lot of people contributed to American culture who themselves did not get acknowledged. It is certainly well past due that we acknowledge many of these people. In fact, there are more to be rediscovered for sure. Shine a light and bring credit to those people because they sure deserve it.
Encompassing influences from cultures the world over, the music of the mountains is something truly unique.
African and Native and Scott Irish and Irish music.
And all this music fused together to create the blend that is today Appalachian music. Black music is an essential part of that blend.